I guess we're running out of time, so to be brief on this enormous topic. 40 years ago, I'd say, when I came back to this country and tried to become a lawyer, I came back from an experience of living in another country and observing what I thought was the contribution the law could give to a revolution, to a social movement and the civil rights movement in New York. And it took a while for me to experience properly the shock and the realization that this country does not even have a written constitution. And so assessing what the speakers in the previous session were adverting to, which is the concept of the rule of law. What is the rule of law when the law in this country is not bound by constitutional principles as its underpinning? And so much of the struggle we have and the suspect communities who are represented here today, some of them celebrating 30 years or more of their battles and victories and struggles. Part of the difficulty in hanging on to anything is it hasn't been always, in the past years, just a battle for justice in individual case against case, or a battle against police suspicion that has resulted in wrongful convictions, as something more dire at fault. There's a fault mechanism in the construct of this country and how we approach things. And it's hard to understand it. If you think the beginnings of the conflict in the north of Ireland in the last century, it was people marching peacefully, campaigning for their most basic civil rights, who were gunned down by the army, the British Army, which gave birth to reaction, armed reaction, for 25 or more years. But in all of that, and all of the horrors of the suspect community in Britain, the north of Ireland, but shame on us for how we allowed a suspect community to be created. What did we do? What did we not do? There come revelations, there come suddenly the image of men or women bursting out of court who you realize have been buried alive in English prisons for 15, 16, 18 years. And it's like a seismic reaction and shift, briefly. But without grappling with what else is at work, it isn't a question of not living in the past, it's a question of not learning from the past, not analysing how we got there. So when it comes to other suspect communities, we find in turn that there haven't just been the overt expressions of oppression through the application of just laws. It's much more construct of laws that are in themselves unlawful, the victories, the battles that have to be fought to show that internment is unlawful, control orders are unlawful, the use of evidence that comes from torture is unlawful. But as victories are won, as suspect communities rise up and battle and prove their point decade by decade, the state learns too. And so the state has moved in some ways from overt application of oppression to covert. So when jury trials have succeeded, and there are many people here today who have fought the most extraordinary battles in front of juries and won. When jury trials have won, the state in the recent decade has moved to juryless trials, to secret courts, to detaining people on the basis of secret evidence, indefinitely without trial, for deportation to countries that torture, civil actions now bringing, if you're wrongfully convicted, you won't know the result if you lose or win, because civil courts have now introduced secret proceedings. So it's although we have devastating examples like the suspectization of the protest community, we find the devastating evidence of undercover police comes to light, and quite extraordinary people like Helen Steele, who's here today, have exposed what's been done. But what does the state do? It sets up an inquiry in which, likely as not, the police in the investigation are going to have their evidence heard in secret session. But where are we now? Let us understand how far down the line we have got. We know nobody here needs to be taught the use of the media, the government narrative, the use of the law, the implementation, particularly under the concept of terrorism, to frighten and to rush through legislation, lawful or unlawful at the end of the day, that is there to stay. The progression began in 1974, rushed in with legislation after Paddy Hill was arrested. That didn't go away. It's been built on and built on. But where we are today is truly, truly terrifying. Truly terrifying. The covert oppression by the use of law is now aimed at children. And this is why it's hard to get a hold of it. A duty is put on a teacher, a duty is put on a social worker, a duty is put on a doctor to identify in the youngest of the young trains of thinking that the state deems it doesn't want. And there is ongoing, day by day, effectively the abduction of children in this country from their parents. It is quite extraordinary, but it is by stealth. It doesn't come to light. Occasionally, the brave individual comes to light who is prepared to say, my child wrote an essay in which our terraced house was described as a terrorist house. Yes, it's laughable, and maybe shame, public shame, comes from highlighting the absurdity. But day by day, what we have done in this country and what we are doing now is using the law secretly, silently, to terrify an entire community, the Muslim community in this country. It is beyond what will be done in a dictatorship. Yeah. It is totally beyond what would be done in the most authoritarian of societies. And I realize we're out of time, but just if I could give the other end of the spectrum in relation to this. Yesterday, there was a decision in the High Court that related to a number of Libyan men who, in this country, after Tony Blair had said the rules of the game have changed, following the 7/7 bombings, which, as we know, were perpetrated by young British men, nevertheless, a number of foreign foreign nationals who had asylum in this country were suddenly locked up for deportation, this group of men, to Gaddafi's torturing regime. At the end of the day, there was a revolution in Libya. They were detained for deportation in the Special Immigration Appeals Commission on the basis of secret evidence. Post the revolution in Libya, the vaults were opened, and what was found was the detailed log of meetings between MI5, MI6, and Libyan torturing intelligence, delivering men for rendition and torture to the jails, exposing the lists of questions coming from the intelligence services of this country to be asked of the tortured men. The men here, detained on secret evidence that came from the torture cells of Libya, after the exposure of this evidence, sued the intelligence services and the Foreign Office and the Home Office. Yesterday, a court decided their civil claims would not be allowed to continue, could not continue, despite mountains uniquely of documentary evidence proving unlawful complicity, criminal collaboration. The reason why the claims will not continue is that in relation to the deportation and the subsequent control orders, the secret evidence, the court said, was known to ministers, and thinking the unthinkable was known to the court that was deciding the deportation proceedings. So if it was known that the evidence came from the torture cells of Libya, if that was known, what does it say about the rule of law in this country? And so that's where we are. It isn't optimistic, it's pessimistic. But it's pessimistic in the context, it is so bad that shame on us if we cannot now say in this country, the time has come when the rule of law is not a rule of law that we can abide by, if this is the extent to which it's deployed against us. I'm so sorry it's so late.